everyone. Good evening to everyone who has come to the Debate Society's newest Monday night debate on the motion, "This House opposes TTIP." I hope everyone who is here knows what TTIP is. TTIP is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which is an international trade agreement being negotiated as we speak. It's a very contentious issue, so I'm not even going to define it anymore. I'm going to leave it to our speakers who disagree deeply on what TTIP is. So I'm just going to explain what the society is and what we do. Then I'll talk about how tonight is going to run, and then I'll introduce your speakers and we'll get to what you come here to watch, them speaking about this very interesting issue which I'm hoping to learn on as well. So I'm the president of the society, thus this is the treasurer, Surya, and we'll be up here moderating tonight's debate and running things. What the society does is we run public debates every Monday at 7 or 7:15 as it is, on various issues. We've had making pornography illegal this year. We'll be having things on NATO soon enough. We talk about economics, international relations, social issues, anything which can be debated, we debate. And I hope I see a lot of you at our future Monday ones. I've seen a lot of you at previous ones already. We also on Thursdays run training sessions on how to debate, which are great fun, which can teach you how to be as good a speaker as our training officers, who are excellent speakers. They're somewhere in the audience, there's one of them. And if you turn to them, you do have to be a member of the society, so please buy our membership at the Clubs and Society Centre or online, and then turn up to training sessions and learn how to be a great debater. That's really fun. And one special event which we're holding at the moment is on Saturday. We are hosting one of the rounds of the competition, an international competition for school-age debaters at UCL in partnership with Oxford. We've got plenty of judges. We need more judges and volunteers to help us run it and to watch and rate and be around some really excellent school-age debaters. It's going to be loads of fun from 9 to 5 on Saturday. So I encourage you all to go to our Facebook page, talk to the training officer, sign up for it, because it's going to be great. Everyone will be there and we'll have like food and fun, and it'll be excellent. So that's what we do as a society. In terms of tonight, you might see down here that we have a laptop on which we are recording and live streaming tonight's events. In order to do that, we have to get the informed consent of every person who's speaking, because no one likes to be recorded about a contentious issue when they don't know that their sayings are being put down into posterity forevermore. So please don't record yourselves unless you have also got consent from a speaker. Later on, when you, the audience, can get involved, I will be getting your consent or unconsent if you want to be filmed or do not want to be filmed. There's also wine down here if you want to get some of that. There's still quite a lot there. Come down and break between speeches if you want to refill your audience. The format we're using tonight is 7-minute speeches for the main speakers. So each of these speakers will have 7 minutes to put forward their views. At 1 minute in to each of their speeches, we will bang on the gavel once, like this, and then anyone in the audience or on the opposing side of the panel can ask a question to the speaker. Please keep it very short. If you want to ask something, stand up and say, "I have a question," or "on that point." And then the speaker can accept your question or decline. Don't feel bad if the decline happens all the time. And say a little 10 to 15 second thing that you've thought up. It's great fun to have public figures answer you and listen to what you have to say.
And we're allowed to do it.
Yeah, you're allowed to do it to the people inside. But as I said, you're very much allowed to refuse quantum information, so please do.
Can ask your own.
At 6 minutes in, then you won't be able to ask them anymore at all, or bang at all, and no more questions can be offered. Then at 7 minutes in, we'll bang twice, which will signify that the speech is coming to an end. These main speeches will run with one from proposition, then one from opposition, the second from proposition, and the second from opposition. After those main speeches, we get to the floor speeches, which are possibly the reason why I see some of the audience tonight. Anyone here can come down to the front and make a 3-minute speech on this issue. You can speak in proposition of it, opposing TTIP. You can speak in opposition of it, saying that you are for it, or you can speak in abstention, which is the middle position. You can't make up your mind, you're not fully persuaded, you just don't know, or you want to inject something into the debate without taking an explicit side. So everyone, while you're watching this, think stuff up. If something hasn't been said, come down and say it, because what you can do when making a floor speech is win a prize. We offer, they're not here now, I'm just going to get them out, a box of chocolates, imagine them in my hands, and a bottle of port, so you can pick between those. People usually go for the port, but the chocolate's very nice. And yeah, I encourage everyone to think up a 3 minutes or less floor speech for that time. After we've done the floor speeches, we'll have summary speeches. Then each of these sides you see will have 4 minutes between them. So the opposition block will have 4 minutes to split between them. The proposition block will have 4 minutes to split between them to put forward their final remarks on the subject. Coalesce everything they've heard tonight into their conclusionary remarks and try to persuade you in a final effort to vote for them. Because this is a debate and because we want to know how you guys were persuaded, we vote. We vote at the end, as I just said, but we also vote at the beginning to know how people feel when they're coming in. Because sometimes students particularly skewed, or the room is particularly skewed on a certain issue, we'll know how people are persuaded, not just what they think anyway. So if I can get my 2 vote counters to come down, and I'll get to reading out the 3 positions you can take, and you will raise your hands. You can, as I said, go proposition, which is opposing TTIP, you don't like TTIP, or you can be opposition, so you're for TTIP, you think it's a good thing, or you can be abstention, which is a number of different reasons you could go for that. But the central issue is that you're not on either side. You can't make it right, you're in the middle still. So, who right now characterizes themselves as being a proposition voter? Who does oppose TTIP? This house opposes TTIP, and who votes with this house? Please keep it high, not the speakers. I mean, they're not looking at me anyway. Looks like. Yep, we've got the numbers 3. So those are down, and now I'd like to take the votes of the opposition, those who are for TTIP. So the motion is this house opposes TTIP. You're opposing that. You're for TTIP. Okay, got the numbers down. And now the 3rd position of abstention. Who abstains on this motion? This house opposes TTIP. Who is abstaining? Who is uncertain? Okay, thank you for the votes, which I will keep super secret until we've taken the final vote as well. It looks like there's a very high abstention number in this room, so there is all to play for tonight from our main speakers. Those, I just want to say one more thing before I get to introduce speakers. I've spoken about how you can ask speakers questions in a certain point in their speech. I've spoken about how you can come down with a floor speech yourself. You can also tweet with the hashtag UCLUdebating. We'll get that up on the board as soon as some tweets start rolling in. It won't be all of them up there, it'll just be the highlights, but you can tweet up there. And you can also, of course, look on your phone and search for hashtag and you'll see all of the things that are being tweeted. So that's a way to engage in the debate if you don't have the confidence or the voice tonight to come up tonight and make an actual physical speech. So now I've gone through everything. Now I hope everyone understands everything. I'll explain this stuff again before each of the stages, so you don't need to write it down. But everyone's got a grasp on what's going to happen, and everyone's looking forward to an excellent debate. So I'm now ready to introduce the 4 speakers we have. I'll explain who each they are, go through their biographies before we get to the first speaker after I've gone through all of them. But I hope we can welcome them all here tonight with a round of applause now at the beginning. Speaking first in proposition is John Hillary. John is the Executive Director of War on Want. He's published widely on many issues of globalization and trade policy. And his report on TTIP, co-authored with the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, has now been translated into 12 European languages. In 2013, John was appointed Honorary Professor in the School of Politics and International Relations at the University of Nottingham, and his book, The Poverty of Capitalism, Economic Meltdown and the Struggle for What Comes Next, was published by Pluto Press the same year. Please welcome John here tonight. Our first speaker in opposition is Bob Blackman, MP. Bob Blackman is the Conservative MP for Harrow East and presently serves as the Joint Secretary of the prestigious 1922 Committee within Parliament. Bob was also a member of Brent Council for nearly 24 years. Since being elected MP for Harrow East in 2010, Bob has been able to bring his extensive experience in local government to bear on many of the issues facing government today through his work on the Communities and Local Government Select Committee. He's taken a lead role in securing compensation for equitable life policyholders as co-chairman of the APPG, as well as championing the fight against smoking in his role as chairman of the APPG for Action on Smoking and Health, and providing a platform for British Hindus to engage with Parliament as chair of the APPG, British Hindus, vice chair of the APPG against anti-Semitism, and secretary of the APPG for British Jews. Please welcome him here tonight. Speaking second in proposition, we have Sam Mark-Lowe. Sam heads up Friends of the Earth's work on trade and sits on the board of the Trade Justice Movement. He writes and speaks extensively on the potential environmental and climate implications of EU trade policy, with a specific focus on TTIP. In 2015, he was invited to present oral evidence to the Parliamentary Environmental Audit Committee inquiry into TTIP, so please welcome him here tonight. And our fellow speaker speaking second in opposition, we have Jordan Anderson. Jordan works as a country risk analyst forecasting political, security and business environments, specializing in Central Africa. He holds an MA distinction in Intelligence and International Security from King's College London. Jordan is also the winner of 15 debating competitions, the semi-finals of the World Universities Debating Competition. So please welcome him here tonight. You can tell that we've got an excellent panel and we've got an interesting issue, an engaged audience. So now I will yield the floor again to the first speaker for proposition, John Hillary.
Well, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here this evening. I have spent the last 20 years specialising in trade policy, and I can tell you in those 20 years, it was not always the case that you would have a packed room like this to hear a debate on the arcane and obscure issue of trade and investment. So I'm thrilled to be here, but I'm not going to use any more of my 7 minutes on these niceties. I'm going to go straight in to 3 things that TTIP isn't and 3 things that TTIP is. The first, TTIP, Trade and Investment Partnership, isn't actually about trade. If you think back to the trade deals of the 20th century, they were about trade. They were about negotiations that one side would be negotiating on coffee, the other side would be negotiating on steel. You'd have a battle to see who would drop their tariff barriers, and that would be the negotiation. TTIP's not about that. The EU and the US already have very, very low tariff barriers to each other. So what TTIP's about is reaching behind the border and re-engineering the social and economic space in which we live. They call it getting rid of regulatory barriers. So that's the first thing to remember. TTIP is not about trade. If TTIP doesn't go through, we will continue to trade. All of the trade will stay the same. This isn't about the sense of us becoming North Korea and shutting our shop. It's about the terms of trade, and that's what we're going to come on to. The second thing that TTIP isn't, it isn't for us. TTIP was expressly designed in the interests of big business. It was started by a group called the Transatlantic Business Dialogue, which is the chief executives of the biggest companies from Europe and the USA who got together to set it out even as long ago as the 1990s. And from 2011-12, when the European Commission was putting its negotiating mandate together, the European Commission had 119 secret meetings with big business representatives and industrial lobby representatives. We only found out about this through a Freedom of Information challenge. At the beginning, the government here said, don't worry, yes, it was created by big business for big business, but the benefits could trickle down to ordinary working people as well. And one of the stats which they kept on bringing up, not quite yet, this is coming in a second. One of the stats that they kept on bringing up was that TTIP could lead to anything up to £10 billion in growth to the British economy. Now, we went back to the government, we said, well, you know that's not true, don't you? And they admitted to us, yeah, actually, that's a bogus statistic. So I'm really hoping for Mr. Blackman's sake that his researchers have not put it in his notes, because that's already being discounted by the government. Instead, what they've said to us, in real terms, TTIP will lead to the loss of at least 1 million jobs between the European Union and the USA. Not our figures, that's their official statistics. So the second thing TTIP is not, it's not for us, it's for big business. And the third thing that it's not democratic. One of the key things about TTIP is that it's being negotiated behind closed doors. At the beginning of the negotiations, the European Commission put a 30-year ban on all public access to the key documents in it. And you think to yourself, well, if it was really that good, why would they be keeping it that secret? And we've pushed and pushed and pushed to get access to these documents. And they said, no way. The only people who can have access are the MEPs, the members of the European Parliament, who get to go into a special room. They're told as they enter the room to give in their cameras, their phones, or anything that they could actually take a copy of the documents. While they're there, they have someone sitting next to them, like the Stasi in all these German times, telling them what they can and they can't take out. And if that's democratic, then I'm an astronaut. So that's three of the things that TTIP isn't. Yeah? What about what it is? Now, I mentioned at the beginning, TTIP is about deregulation. This idea of trying to get rid of barriers to the maximization of profits for big business. That's really at the heart of it. And we said, well, what are they talking about when they're talking about these regulatory barriers? What do they mean when they talk about getting rid of regulatory barriers? And they made a list for us, which is very convenient. We could read it. The first thing, labour standards. They want to get rid of labour rights. Environmental standards. Rules which affect our public safety in terms of health. Food safety rules. A whole lot of things which we would consider to be pretty important and pretty positive things in our lives. But big business doesn't want to have to deal with because it means they don't get to maximize their profits.
So,
yes?
If big business controls the European Union so much that it can get politicians to agree to an agreement with the United States whereby they drop those regulations, couldn't they just use that influence to abolish the regulations in the first place? Or is this a conspiracy?
I think that's exactly what they are doing. They are using their power in order to try to get rid of these regulations. And what's interesting, it's not just for now, but it's for the future. Because one of the other things in TTIP is to set up a regulatory cooperation body, which will mean in the future, if we allow it to go through, that big business has a standing power to vet all future rules and regulations that any European country, including ours, comes up with. So that's the first thing. Deregulation is what it is about. The second thing it's about locking in privatization. As you will have recognized if you've been paying attention over the last few years, pretty much everything in our country has been privatized already. So TTIP's not necessarily going to come in and do that. But what it does do is it locks in privatization. It makes it effectively irreversible in the world's life. But the third thing, because I think that was my 1 minute signal, the third thing in TTIP is the most outrageous. It is this new power given to big multinational corporations to be able to sue the UK government for any future law or regulation that's brought in which might affect their profits. And it's fascinating to hear Mr. Blackman is a campaigner against smoking, because of course one of the most well-known cases has been brought by Philip Morris, the big multinational corporation, against Australia and against Uruguay in order to try and stop them putting these big public health safety warnings on the cigarette packet. Australia has just managed to fight it off, but it cost the Australian government $50 million of taxpayers' money just in the legal fees to fight that off. So these are three reasons, and there are hundreds more, but I believe that you should be voting for the proposition and therefore the opposition to TTIP. Thank you.
Thank you for that very warm welcome for our first excellent speech from the first speaker for proposition. Can I now invite to respond to him the first speaker of our opposition, Bob Blackman, MP.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction and for the warm welcome. And I look forward to the debate that we're going to have on this particular subject. When I was invited to speak here, it was interesting that I was invited to speak for or against the proposition as I saw fit, but I was very pleased to actually oppose this position. What we should be clear is that Britain is a trading nation. If we don't trade, we cease to exist as a nation state. And we should remember, for all of you who think about the future and what the future holds for all of you in terms of employment, in terms of opportunities, then clearly free trade and freeing up trade is the way to generate a lively and successful economy, to maximise the number of jobs, and to create the opportunity that all of us seek. Now, what we should remember is that between the European Union and the United States of America, it represents almost half of the world's gross domestic product. We are clearly in a position whereby if we can reduce the rules and regulations, tariffs and barriers that prevent trade, there is clearly an opportunity to improve both the amount of trade, opening up new markets, and generating new opportunities for people. So what this agreement is all about is creating a position whereby we in Europe, we in Britain, will have access to markets in the United States of America of 300 million people. An opportunity for not just big business, as our proposers have suggested, but also small and medium-sized businesses. The opportunity to export, the opportunity to grow their businesses, the opportunity to add more employees to their
On that
firms.
point,
Yes, indeed, I give way.
so presumably deregulation deregulates the working conditions we are in. How do we get a guarantee that the people at the bottom see the money going to the top?
Well, clearly one of the myths which has been peddled already is that in somehow, shape or form, that our capability, either in this country or as part of the European Union, in some way, shape or form, this would diminish or reduce workers' rights. That's quite clearly incorrect. The position will still be that national governments, where they have power, and the European Union, where it has power, will have the position to regulate the market and regulate the rights of individuals. There is no proposition that means that people will not see a diminution of their rights, capability, or rates of pay. So it's quite clear that the myths that are being peddled are, of course, ones that are incorrect. You'll also hear another. I'll just make this point, and then I'll happily take your intervention. The other myth that has been given is about privatisation. That somehow, shape or form, our National Health Service will be privatised as a result of all this. Well, actually, our National Health Service has about 6% of the overall amount of expenditure out to private contract at the moment. By the way, most of that was done by the last Labour government. So before anyone thinks about who did this. But the myth that is peddled is that somehow, shape or form, big business will come in, we'll no longer be able to have our National Health Service, it will be done away with and privatised and will be into private medical care. Absolute rubbish. And quite clearly, the position is that we will still run our National Health Service as we choose and as our government chooses to do so. If a government were foolish enough to go down a privatisation route on the National Health Service, it would be open to another government to correct that position in the future. The young lady there.
So you said TTIP is good because it encourages a free market and gets rid of regulations. However, you also said, but we will keep lots of regulations in place so we don't affect workers' rights at all. Could you clarify what are the bad regulations you would like to remove and why only those would be touched?
No, I think the clear point is that there is, across this market, we have created in the European Union a single market. In the United States, there are broad ranges of markets. What we want to see is those rules and regulations as a level playing field to be the best opportunity for everyone who's trading in this trade bloc, as opposed to removing them altogether. I'll give way once more, and then I'm going to see. Yes.
Is the official document of losing government as well?
Sorry, I didn't.
Is the official document stating that there will be lots of jobs on it as well?
Well, I think the concept of jobs are reduced. For example, in this country, we have lost jobs from the public sector over the last 5 years, but we've created twice as many in the private sector as those things have gone on. This is all about creating jobs and opportunities for people to trade, as well as reducing some of the jobs in these regulatory areas. And personally, before I went into Parliament, I was in a regulatory area. So I know what those can do to constrain trade and prevent growth of the economy, which then generates new opportunities, new businesses, and opportunities for new firms, and equally for existing firms to trade further and to expand. And we have a clear opportunity here for extended trade right across Europe and the United States. And finally, I think the key issue, which we should all look at, is this would be a free trade agreement, but it should not be seen as being the end of free trade agreements. I would wish to see, and I think those that would support this agreement would want to see this free trade agreement extended further beyond the United States and Europe to the whole of the world. I want to see it extended to the Commonwealth. I want to see it extended to other countries that have the opportunity there to trade without the artificial barriers, the rules and regulations that prevent them from growing, and then limiting their capability as countries to generate their own economies, their own jobs, and their own environment in which we wish to see. So quite clearly, I would suggest to all of those of you that have thought, I'm not quite sure about the benefits of this, hence why you suggested you'd abstain. The opportunities are going to be there, they are legion. And we would say, take the opportunity, do not fear the future, because this gives a great opportunity for everyone to succeed in life.
Thank you to Bob Blackman for that very excellent opening opposition speech. And now I would like to invite the second proposition speaker, Sam Marklow, to continue the proposition arguments. Welcome him here.
Hello, everyone. Just thought, I want to try something. I did try to do this over the weekend, where I was admittedly at a wedding and told to stop being boring. It didn't work, but it might work here. I want to ask you to consider what is the biggest global threat, maybe the top three facing the world right now. What problem needs to be solved? And now I'm going to ask you if any of you said removing barriers to trade. Can we see any hands? We've got one down here, you brave man. And my point here being is that trade doesn't really come at the top of many people's priorities anymore. Most of these barriers have been removed. Yet time and time again, we continue to see trade trumping other policy objectives. What do I mean by this? In Canada and India, we've seen renewable energy programs trampled by World Trade Organization tribunals. We've seen intellectual property incorporated into trade agreements so that it increases the price for medicine for the poorest around the world. We've seen measures to stave off climate change hit by legal challenges to make it prohibitively expensive. My fear with TTIP is not that it will create a system whereby trade is prioritised over all else. It is that it will lock the one that already exists in and will make it very difficult for governments in the future, world governments, collectively, to change it. I'm opposed to TTIP, as you may have gathered, but I'm not an isolationist. Indeed, in the global world that we are in now, there are always going to be some constraints put on governments when facing global challenges. Indeed, all international agreements put these constraints on to one degree, almost by definition. But what I object to is trade being elevated above all else. Because let's be clear, in this global system, trade agreements stand in a league of their own. If you look at climate obligations, if you look at labour obligations, one thing that they all have in common is that they have weak enforcement mechanism. Trade policy, trade agreements, on the other hand, comes with teeth. And in TTIP, these teeth are embossed with the letters ISDS. This is another acronym. This is a very acronym-heavy world, unfortunately. It stands for Investor-State Dispute Settlement. It is a mechanism that allows foreign companies to sue governments if they pursue policy objectives that are deemed to impede the company's ability to profit. These cases average about $8 million a case, and the biggest award has been $50 billion. ISDS is known to have a chilling effect on government actions. Yeah, I'll take that.
Well, the UK has a variety of ISDS treaties with countries around the world that protect British companies operating in those countries. Would you abolish those as well, or is it one rule for the UK and one rule for everyone else?
No, I absolutely believe it should be one rule for everyone. And ISDS is interesting because the reason it exists is to encourage investors to invest in places they wouldn't before. So my first point here is, do you think the US is an unsafe place for UK investors to invest? I would say no. Do we need it there? But then also, more broadly speaking, ISDS is meant to encourage an increase in foreign direct investment from our countries to the others. It's been in trade agreements for 30, 40 years, yet there's still no evidence that it achieves that goal. They've done study after study, there's still no evidence that ISDS needs to increase foreign direct investment. If it doesn't work, why have it? Why put it into the biggest bilateral agreement of all time? Why ensure that it's in all trade agreements from now until forever? And furthermore, while you've heard this off John already, but trade agreements used to be about reducing import tariffs. They used to be about ensuring governments didn't discriminate. TTIP aims to go one step further. It intends to go behind the border and look at removing red tape, removing bureaucracy and differences in regulations, these so-called non-tariff barriers to trade. Now, John's already given some examples of what this can look like, so I won't go into this further. And let's be honest, all this may reduce some costs for some businesses. However, any policy that increases the ability of exporters and investors to influence our rules and regulations comes laced with risk. I'm going to quote Harvard economist Danny Roderick on this. In the TTIP, the reduction of so-called non-tariff barriers to trade between the US and Europe will almost certainly restrict the space for domestic regulatory action. Even if regulatory harmonisation does not create a race to the bottom, the interests of investors and exporters will cast a longer shadow than before over social and environmental goals. And as the TTIP negotiations have progressed, we've caught a glimpse of what this increased investor and exporter influence has. We've seen that in climate legislation in the form of the Fuel Quality Directive in the EU, we saw it was watered down so as not to discriminate against tar sands coming over in its refined form from the US. We've seen the chemical treatment of beef carcasses in our food being approved in what was largely considered to be a good faith measure to the US just before the beginning of the TTIP negotiations. We've seen endocrine disrupting chemicals in pesticides, a decision on whether they are to be banned or not being delayed at the behest of the US trade representation, so as not to create a new tariff barrier, non-tariff barrier, as the talks were ongoing. The European Commission has promised not to lower standards, but as we can see, it's already failing that test. The EU is not negotiating with itself. The US is not negotiating with itself. Compromises will have to be made by both parties if they are to conclude these negotiations. And we've already seen with TTIP, when it comes to compromise, all that's going to be compromised is our food safety, our environmental protections, and our health. TTIP is being sold to us as a trade deal fit for the 21st century. I contend it is instead the death throes of the last. For the chance of a better future, one that protects our environment, our health, our climate, and sorry, I've lost my train of thought. For the chance of a better future, one that prioritises the environment, health, and action on climate change above short-term economic gain, I call on this House to oppose TTIP.
excellent second proposition speech. I'd now like to invite Jordan Anderson, the second opposition speaker, to give our final main speech.
Members of the House, somewhat problematically, the proposition wants to have their cake and eat it at the same time. On the one hand, we are told that trade is wonderful. They are not isolationists. They are not North Korea. They like trade. On the other hand, apparently trade isn't a big deal. It doesn't matter how much of it you get. It's all going to happen anyway, and it's unimportant. What this debate is about isn't even about trade as a consequence, because apparently we both, possibly to differing in sense of sincerity, agree that it's important, agree that it's a good thing, and we want to maximize trade and maximize growth. So when you're asked to vote at the end of this evening, what you're being asked is which side brings you more better trade, which side brings you better growth. And we think that's the opposition. We think that is TTIP. As a heads up, I'm going to make a few fact claims during this debate. I'm going to say this is a thing, this is true. I don't want you just to take my word for it. You have laptops, you have smartphones, and I'm going to tell you where these things come from. And they all come from one place. They actually come from a study that was done by the Center for the Study of Strategic and International Issues Studies. What's important about that is you can go and you can check every single thing that I say here, and you can ask me about it during the questions when you want. So mostly what I want to talk to you about is I want to talk to you about comparing free trade without TTIP and free trade with TTIP. I want to focus in on the question of state companies dispute resolution, which was brought up, and why it's better to have it than it is not to have it when you're dealing with international trade. Replying first, it's important to note that the first speaker mostly apparently opposed TTIP because apparently it's a big conspiracy by big business. They thought it up, so it must be evil. You should probably remember that the European Union started out as an agreement as a coal and steel pact that was designed to facilitate trade by coal and steel companies. It's possible that as a consequence, the EU is a giant coal and steel conspiracy. Or it might not be, right? That is all he told you, was that it started with big businesses, so it must be bad. You probably are all owed better reasoning and better logic than that. Secondly, he told us that it's negotiated behind closed doors, so it must be bad. Note, honorable members of the House, that most international agreements are negotiated behind closed doors. The Iran sanctions agreements that was dropped have been negotiated entirely behind closed doors. There is actually much more democratic access to the TTIP negotiations because every single MEP can show up, listen to it, and then tell his constituency whatever he wants about it, which isn't true of the Iran sanctions. Essentially what the proposition is telling you is that you can't trust any MEP, no matter what their party, no matter what their motivation, no matter what, no thank you, they're arguing about. You can't trust any of them because none of them are going to come out and tell you the truth. That is the level of conspiracy that they're engaging in, and probably why you should reject them for it. Also note, it's possibly unwise for them to make claims about Stasi on this side when someone on their side authored a paper with something called the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, named after the famous Soviet revolutionary who thought that my Polish ancestors should stay part Russia. So that's just an issue for them. But also they've told us that apparently this allows you to abolish state regulations. That's what TTIP does. And it locks in privatization. This is essentially scamming, and this is untrue. It's important to note that what you have when you have ISDS, when you have the ability for states and companies to sue states because of what they do, this isn't about abolishing regulations. Rather, this is about ensuring that governments apply regulations in an equitable manner across companies and across their country. Right? We say, note that if somehow companies have so much control over European governments that they can use them like puppets to abolish all these regulations through the mechanism of TTIP, it would just be easier to have those governments, which they control like puppets, just abolish the regulations to begin with. It would take a lot less time, and you wouldn't have to go through the courts to do it. We would suggest they probably don't actually have that level of control. But you also just can't sue anyone for anything under an ISDS. Rather, you have to be making a claim that the government is discriminating against you and your company specifically, and is treating you in an unfair way that it isn't doing to other ones. Also note that if you decide you really, really don't like this, you can withdraw from a trade treaty like TTIP later on. To take the specific example they brought of Uruguay, and apparently tobacco companies sued them in order to prevent them bringing in plain packaging laws. This wasn't to do with the question of whether or not the state can legislate in order to ensure the public policy upheld. Note that TTIP, along with every agreement that involves ISDS, upholds and enshrines the rights of states to legislate for the public good. Rather, their claim was that when you abolished, or when you required them to sell in plain packaging, this simply moved the trade in cigarettes to smuggled cigarettes to illegal cigarettes, which didn't increase consumption, and which in fact ensured that other people who want them benefited from the sales. They argued it was an example of discrimination, not an example of good policy, and they haven't even won on it. As they noted, that Australia, they lost to Australia. So it's unclear why giving them a mechanism to voice their grievances when they think they're being treated unfairly is a bad thing. Also note that these are incredibly expensive to pursue. You stand a good chance of losing and not getting any of your money. Yes, sir.
Is not putting in a mechanism that will cost the taxpayers £50 million not very much use to us?
Well, the important thing what these tribunals can do is if they decide that a lawsuit is frivolous, if they decide that a claim was without merit, they can assign the costs of that to the party that made the frivolous accusation. There are some instances in which the government may have to pay a lot of money and it's right, but it wins. This is why we allow people to sue the government in general. This is why domestic countries have legislation saying you can sue the government. The important thing about having it be transnational is it gives companies the certainty they need to know they can go and invest in another country. They won't be discriminated against, that they won't be treated unfairly. But it's also important to note that companies that sue governments under ISDS tend to win less than 10% of the damages that they are asking for. That's incredibly important when you're considering this idea they're telling you that apparently companies will sue governments and control them altogether. We think that when you're comparing a world without ISDS with trade and a world with it, it's important to note that companies don't have certainty if they don't know that when the government discriminates against them, if it takes their property, if it damages them, that they can take it to court and ensure that they're treated equitably. It also means that you are free from government meddling, which does occur even in the United States. Note that when a Dubai company won the bid to control the Newark Port Authority, many people in the American government were angry because Arabs. And they felt they couldn't trust an Arab company to overdo it. And as a consequence, they tried to get out of the contract. You can't necessarily trust even first world governments not to be populist, not to be partial, not to be expedient when they have an interest to do so. For the same reason that we have laws that say individuals can sue the state for mistreating it, companies have the same right to sue the state when they are mistreated. ISDS and TTIP gives all this kind of certainty, allows for greater investment, and allows for all the kind of trade and growth that the proposition claim they're in favor of, but they don't get without mechanisms like TTIP. We oppose.
Thank you to John Manderson, the second opposition speaker, and thank you to all of our main speakers for some excellent main speeches that we've had tonight. I hope everyone here is informed. I hope everyone here is ready to start taking their own part in the debates today by putting forward some sort of floor speech. I'm just going to do one thing before we get to that. I'm going to drag that board down because people at the beginning were right. You can't see any of the Twitter feed. I'm sorry. How humiliating. Can I get my tall committee? Because I have a tiny little committee. Thank you, Aidan. Excellent. Ignore the gobbledygook written on it. I think it's partially from maths, partially economics, partially from IR, but not at all about TTIP. What is about TTIP are your floor speeches, which can be made in the position of proposition, so saying that you do oppose TTIP, or opposition, saying that you don't oppose it, or in abstention, which says that you can't make up your mind, that you don't know, or that you just want to say something without picking a side and staking your colours to the mast. Floor speeches can be up to 3 minutes long, and the way they'll work is that we will bang once at 30 seconds, in the same way as in the mains. Questions can then be asked from anyone in the audience, anyone on the panel, and then once at 2 minutes 30 seconds, no more questions can be asked, and then at 3 minutes, which will tell you that your time is coming to a stop, you can have this. It doesn't need to be 3 minutes. You may well just have a little short question you want to put to everyone, a statement which takes no longer than 20 seconds. I still encourage you to make a floor speech if there's something in your head which you want to get out. So, everyone now understands, and I'd like to ask if anyone in the audience has a proposition floor speech inside them. Does anyone in the audience want to come down and argue for opposing TTIP? This house opposes TTIP. Looks like I have a hand in the blue jumper. Please come down.
Hello, everybody. Okay, so I believe I was a bit confused at the beginning, didn't know about TTIP at all. I am midway between the arguments myself about regulation, deregulation, capitalism, force for good or otherwise. I thought the speakers were really good, and I thought they raised some pretty good points. I cannot find any seriously good reason for TTIP. It just sounds to me like a good old lobby play. It sounds like TTIP is pretty much pushed by existing established corporations. I believe corporations should have the ability to be as competitive as possible, especially in today's globalization. We should have a strong partnerships with countries like the US, but I do not see this agreement benefiting UK or American trade per se, as much as benefiting established companies which have considerable power already. And I don't see how this power is benefiting any new developments, and especially new movements of human capital and capital per se. A few questions I have for the opposition speakers are: what type of agreements in specific would allow for new jobs to be created? Surely we live in a time of automation. People are less relevant at the point of supplying utility in the economy. But I just do not see how this TTIP deal will benefit business apart from established corporations. So the question would be, let's have an example of how that would happen.
Thank you, Jack, for an excellent first proposition floor speech of the night. We now come to opposition, the other side of the debate. Who wants to come down and argue in favour of TTIP? The motion is this House opposes TTIP, so who wants to go in opposition to that? Someone arguing for TTIP. I'm just going to generate interest for the next round, but there I have a hand with the black shirt, no, black jacket, white shirt. Come down.
Hello. I recently had this argument with a friend, and I was recently in against TTIP, but after discussing it and after hearing all the floor speeches, it seems that my arguments have shifted quite slightly. From what I'm more understanding, it seems that TTIP is not set in stone. It's not something that was created 30 years ago and is something that will continue since those 30 years. But it seems that they are actually listening to the people. There's actually a lot of more transparency in the sense, like, for example, one of the things which I was very worried about was, for example, food policy within the EU is much stricter than in the US, and they recently put a new part in the TTIP which said, like, for example, new companies, companies from outside the EU could not sue companies within the EU for, governments within the EU for anything ethical, moral, or I think it was health related. This is really vague, so I think it's not a very. It could be swing both ways, but that is one of the points which I want to make. Another one which I want to make is that with the new economic crisis which seems to be looming, which is happening currently in China, and it really seems like there's going to be a new one. I think more cohesion within different countries, less dependency upon only Europe, and more dependency and more collaboration with other countries could provide more stable ground for us to continue into hopefully a more prosperous future that we all be part of. Capitalism isn't great, but it's currently, I feel, the best thing we can make in an international government, within international place, and that's it. I rest my case.
Thank you for that really great, really fun opening opposition floor speech. The third position you can take Another reminder is abstention. Abstention is not proposition or opposition. It's somewhere in the middle for an innumerable number of reasons. Possibly you aren't certain, possibly you think that the question itself has to be uncertain, but it isn't a yes or no answer, or maybe you just want to put someone to the floor without taking a side. So can I get a floor speech from the abstention perspective, an abstention floor speech? You there in the blue shirt, please come down.
I'm going to speak in abstention because I think that I came into the debate not really having much clarity on what TTIP is, and I think I leave also not having some clarity on something that all of the speakers have talked about as one of the most important points, and that is what talking about businesses being able to sue the government. So Mr. Anderson described big businesses taking governments to court as a mechanism to voice grievances. And I think that's a good way to put it, and I think that's very important as well. And then Mr. Blackman said it would be the national government's ability to regulate when able. And so this is kind of my question. My question is, when are you able? I think it's a bit too black and white to say big businesses are evil, you know, everything they want to do is against human rights, etc., etc. That's just not true. But I think that also there are some cases such as suing the government, you know, to put plain packaging on cigarettes, when that's clearly a case of big business doing something that's against a very, very well thought out public policy on the dangers of smoking, etc., etc. So essentially, you know, big businesses aren't bad, governments aren't perfect, but you know, a democratic government undoubtedly serves the people better than the big business who serves the product. So what I think we all need clarity on is whether we're going to be powerless people in the hands of big business. Is this, you know, a force unstoppable? Will we have any control over what's in our food, you know, our health, everything like that? Or is nothing bad actually going to happen, and will there still be sort of powering national governments, powering people? Yeah, that concludes.
Thank you for that. An excellent abstention floor speech. Now we've gone through all three, and we're going to return to the beginning because I think there's enough interest in the crowd to get through another round of floor speeches. So, again, I turn to the proposition voters. Who would like to give a proposition floor speech in favour of the motion this House opposes TTIP? It looks like I have a hand there from the flowery shirt. Please come down.
It may take some time.
When I asked a question about what regulations are good regulations that we want governments to be able to enforce and bad regulations that we're happy for companies to get rid of, I got a really vague response that governments would still have some and that would be fine, but think of the opportunities. Which wasn't really what I was looking for when I asked the question. And then Jordan clarified a little bit by regulations would more or less stay in place, but if companies felt particularly discriminated against, then they could definitely sue, and that is fine. So the thought that came to me was there's a lot of ways where I think the US would definitely be able to say that they were discriminated as companies, specifically in terms of climate change and when governments make moves to stop climate change and reduce carbon emissions, because the US refuses to sign up to a lot of carbon emission reduction things. They refuse to put carbon emission reduction taxes or general levels on their companies, whereas the EU does. And what happens when the EU does that is those companies have to respond to the change. They have to innovate. They have to find a new way for their company to work so they can hit those targets. Now, what happens when the EU, like countries within the EU who adhere to these targets, have a contract for something and require a company that will actually hit those targets? Well, the US can then say, no, you are definitely discriminating against us in this instance because we've never had to hit those targets, we either can't go for those contracts, or do you know how much it will cost us to entirely innovate and start our industries fresh so we hit your targets? No, we are definitely going to sue in that area. I think this is far more likely than the plain packaging of cigarettes that somehow increases like people faking it, and that is it. Like, that doesn't seem like the most discriminatory thing possible, and they were willing to sue that. I think in the example of reducing carbon emissions, that is a much more solid ground to sue. And when the kind of groups that would be able to do that are people who will be backed by massive oil companies and like the kind of industries that have absolutely all the money and also a lot of influence on international governments. That's the kind of companies who will probably be able to win these suits against countries. And even if they don't, they're the kind of companies who will be able to have very, very expensive lawyers who can drag these trials out a very, very long time, which will mean like governments will be very reluctant to engage in that very long and drawn out tribunal. So we're going to be very reluctant actually to sign up to international agreements and international targets for reducing climate change. And actually I do totally agree with the proposition that we do already trade and trade quite well. And for if there is going to be a small increase in trade, that might be nice, but that small increase in trade is definitely not worth the trade-off of absolutely like of governments being scared to introduce policies to stop climate change, which is kind of important in the long term for our lives and people's lives afterwards. So yeah, definitely.
Thank you for that very good second floor speech and proposition. Now I think you all know I'll be going to the opposition audience for a second opposition floor speech. Can I find anyone in the audience who wants to give a floor speech arguing for TTIP? So against the motion, this House opposes TTIP. I'm looking for someone who comes down who wants to give a little speech on that. Doesn't need to be 3 minutes, can be shorter and just be a statement. I've got two hands, your hand was there higher and longer, so please come down lower in the blue jumper. It's always difficult when people wear the same things. Come on, right.
Says the man in the red jumper.
Yeah, sure. So I'd just like to start by saying that trade is one of the most important issues facing the UK today. It ranks among environmental issues, whether or not we leave the European Union, and the impacts of globalization and what that means for security, defense, and other issues. And the question we ask ourselves with this particular issue is, what will the impact of TTIP be either way? And while I did enjoy all of the floor speeches today, I don't think they really addressed that particular question. While there has been much contention over what the impact will be on environmental legislation, including the recent deal on climate emissions, I think that TTIP does benefit the UK. And it is to do with the breaking down of the barriers that we face in our trade with the US. I think a distinction needs to be made between the values of firms and the values of the US government itself. And I think that's been a point that hasn't really been addressed today. The fact is, we need new jobs in this economy, and the only way we can create those new jobs is by one of two things: either increasing the size of government and the public sector creating these jobs, or somehow enticing trade outside the UK or into the UK. And that is the future of our political economy. And the fact that we have a political divergence within our country means that though democracy is very important to us, and we should be looking at a more open trading system, we need to look at our biggest trading partner outside the EU, which is the US. Ethical, moral, and health obligations are important, and yes, I do believe that TTIP needs to address those concerns of UK citizens, but it also needs to tell us that we should open up our borders and promote a sustainable agenda on the issue of ISDS, it's only, just a moment, thank you. It's just a primary sort of piece to stop governments from overreaching their powers, and it is to do with whether the limits of governments are alive. The difference between firms and governments is that they are not always the same in their interests, but they can be. And the fact is, we need to reach a common position with the US, and the first step to do that is through TTIP.
Thank you for that great second floor speech in opposition. Really good stuff. And now I'd like to get a third floor speech in this round, a second floor speech in abstention. So who wants to give a speech in abstention on this motion, abstaining on this decision, neither for nor against TTIP? I have 3 hands, eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Can I get you in the black hat? Please come down. Big fan of people who wear hats. Yes, you are identified. Yeah, that's fine.
So I just wanted to clarify a couple of points that were made. The figure of 6% of private investment in NHS, which was published by the government, was in fact proven wrong last year, and independent charity claimed that it was actually 36% of private investment. Yeah, within the NHS. Yeah, correct. And it was actually widely reported. And there was actually another figure, which is Freedom of Information Act for a CCG, which said 41%. So that's a point to be made. Also, the profit that can be made from small and medium businesses, I would argue that, are they being included in negotiations if they're the ones who you're claiming are being targeted to be profited from investment in the US? Because the facts that have been shown so far have been that big businesses are the ones involved in negotiations. And then another argument is the trickle-down effect. Like, I'm not sure why you present it when there's a huge amount of criticism for that theory. Now, my argument is this, that there's a lot of points that have been made for and against, and there's a lot of people here showing the interest in the topic. So if there is this much public interest, why is there not public involvement in the decision-making process? We've proven that we can have votes on matters that have great interest and great importance to the public. The Scottish independence vote was huge in what it was able to achieve in terms of democracy. We have the EU vote coming up, which has the same principle, that we are being given a choice on things that matter to us. And incidentally, the EU vote shows that what initially started off as a trade agreement is now having to be decided because there's so many pros and cons towards the issue. And so perhaps maybe we should start with that. We should start with the public making a decision as opposed to government and businesses negotiating for us, because in the past it has been proven not to necessarily work. And with something as important as this that can affect all of us, I think that we should have a say. So that's basically what I think.
Thank you for that really good second abstention floor speech there. I almost said third, and that's because I want to go for a third round of floor speeches. I think was the interest. I think a lot of our floor speakers are adding things which haven't been discussed already. So I want to see more of that. I want to see more things. So I'm going to go to another floor speech in proposition on this motion. I want another person to come down to oppose TTIP. It looks like I have a hand there, and your hand was there last time. Please come down.
It's pretty big. Okay. Yeah, I just have one issue. Like, I think Prop has made a very good case so far. We've talked about ISDS, and we've talked about how big corporations might interfere in the introduction of new legislation. The one thing we haven't touched yet is the immediate impact what this will have, and that is in regulation. Now, I think the EU website has this has a link to a wonderful PDF, which is just completely ambiguous about what's going to happen to regulation. But they do say that what is most likely to happen is that American companies will be allowed to sort of carry on with their existing regulations, and EU companies will be allowed to carry on with their existing regulations, which means that it is, and given the nature of, given the fact that regulations in America are less strict, it means that companies in America will have lower production costs, and therefore they're competing with UK businesses now. They don't have any customs, so American products will flood the UK market, and UK businesses, which for whom it costs a lot more to make the same products, will have to compete with lower priced American products, and they will lose out that trade. Yes.
So if people so opposed about products coming from the United States, we just cannot buy the products. We can see.
But they will be lower priced. So the point is they will be lower priced. And here the people don't care about the general population doesn't care about, okay, so this is a British product. People will think actually this is going to help me save my this will help me build up my disposable income for the end of the month. So people are going to go with what is cheaper, and this will hit hugely small to medium enterprises in the UK. And those are the ones that really have to struggle, and those are the ones that are just coming out of a really difficult time. If we see a build-up in the interest rate, which is likely to happen because we've had low interest rates for such a long time, if they start going up, they can't borrow loans. Most of these small to medium enterprises in the UK also tend to be sole traders and partnerships, which means that if they see the business going downhill, they're likely to abandon it. They can't, because they have unlimited because it's unlimited liability. So they're very much likely to lose their jobs. So very much likely that these people and these businesses, which have about, I think, 80% of the British workforce, are very likely to see a drop in their standards of living, which is a very immediate impact that TTIP will bring about to a majority of businesses in the UK. And yeah, just because we get more trade doesn't mean it's good trade. Thank you.
Thank you for that proposition floor speech. Excellent proposition floor speech. And now I'd like to get the final, the fundamental, the ultimate opposition floor speech. The third opposition floor speech. So I want someone to come down to say that they are for TTIP, against the motion of opposing TTIP. I have a hand, I believe, on the right, the second blue jumper, very stylish man. Please come down.
Hi, so thank you so much, by the way. I thought all of your speeches were really good. I just wanted to make a few points. So the first was on this big issue of regulation, which I think is obviously a really important issue, but I also think it's quite, people like to sort of scaremonger a little bit. So they're like, the Americans are going to put poison in your foods and they're going to put all these chemicals in, when really a lot of the time, I don't think this is true. If you look at sort of age expectancies in the US and in the UK, they're very similar. They're like 79 and 80, that sort of thing. Obviously there are a million different products that can be regulated, but just one of which is like, so I've been to quite a few TTIP debates, and one that they always use is eggs. So they say, in America, eggs are bleached, and this is to kill any bacteria on the eggs. In the UK, we don't bleach our eggs. So this is just one small, tiny little thing that actually we don't do anyway. You know, we don't actually do enough of what the Americans do, type of thing. So that's just one thing to point out, that I really don't think it's like all these poisons that are being put into our foods and that sort of thing. The second thing was on inequality. So actually inequality is a huge issue. And one of the biggest forms of inequality is high prices. So whether this be high prices of food or high prices in products. And what actually happens within trade, most economists will agree with this, trade actually results in the reduction of prices in goods. This is one thing that actually I don't think has been mentioned enough. Even whether it just be the simple reduction in the tariff rates, or whether it be the introduction of more businesses that are going to reduce costs, this can have a huge effect on inequality, like massive effects. No, thank you. So even whether it be, you know, a parent who's not able to feed her children, we've seen a huge rise in food banks, this sort of situation. Whether it be that they're able to buy an extra loaf of bread a week, or whatever it may be, if that's what TTIP is going to help achieve, then I'm personally all for it. Also, just in terms of small businesses, I do think it's really important that we know that small businesses can open up their trade to the US. What this means is that many businesses start paying additional revenue, we start receiving additional revenues and pay additional taxes on this, which again can go into the tax system and help reduce inequality through redistribution. So with that, I think that's everything. Of course, I'd like to say I am no expert in any of these things. These are all come from previous TTIP debates that I've been to, but they're just a few small points that I've recognised and would like to add. Thank you.
Thank you for that very good opposition floor speech there. And I'd like to now take the final floor speech of the evening. We have one more space for one more abstaining speaker. So it looks like I have a number of hands. I'm sorry to those who I pick. No, I'm sorry to those who I don't pick. Those who I pick are very lucky. And the one who I'm picking now is you in the light blue jumper. Please come down.
Okay, so like I want to raise a point. Like when he asked the question, what is the problem do you think comes to your mind regarding global crisis? The first thing came to my mind was climate change. And with the historic COP21 going on, like passing through and almost finished, I don't know why any of the speakers have not talked about climate change per se. I think only she raised the point. So I had a statistic where in 2013, the impact assessment report of the future of EU-US trade relations by the EU raised the point that if the TTIP goes through, it is going to result in millions of more carbon emissions. So I don't care about trade or no trade or deregulation or tariff or I care about climate change right now. And if this is the situation, as she raised out, EU cares about climate change and United States is not that much concerned, but if EU cares, what is the credibility of the solution, EU solution to climate change? If it lets this TTIP go through, knowing that there is an EU impact assessment which says that it's going to result in a huge amount of carbon emissions.
Thanks for that final abstention floor speech, and indeed for all the floor speakers. You were all very good, and one of you will be the winner. We'll decide who. Before that, we have the final input from our main speakers. We have the summary speeches. Opposition will go first, and then for opposition will have 4 minutes combined between them to put their final case to you, and then proposition will have that. So you'll be able to split it up how you feel fit. You can have one speaker take all the 4 minutes, or each of you can take 2. In order to make this easy for you, we will bang once at 2 minutes in, and then twice at 4 minutes in, so that you know that that's the point to split, and that's the point to end. Okay. One more thing for the audience. Unfortunately, the time of points of information and questions has passed. Don't offer any to these speakers. We want them to be able to make their cases unadulterated, purely, without interruption, so that you come onto the final vote with their words ringing in your ears. And so, with no more ado, I would like to introduce whoever has decided that they will be the first opposition floor speaker, summary speaker. There you go, the opposition speakers, summary speakers.
What the proposition has brought you in today's debate is what I would call Schrodinger's government. On the one hand, it is a government that is so controlled by the corporations that will give them the right to sue them and undo their regulations. And on the other hand, it's a government that just wants to do good policy. And suddenly, as soon as TTIP is in, corporations will sue it and stop it doing all the wonderful policies it really wants to do, except that it wants to let the corporations sue them so it can't do them. They've also questioned on that side, do we really need more trade? Things are fine. We'd say rather the reason that countries are willing to engage in TTIP negotiations is because they see the importance of more trade, they see the importance of economic growth, and they understand why that's important. What this debate is about today is about whether or not you think governments should have to have laws and rules when they deal with corporations. And we've had a little bit of a challenge as to what are some of the examples that we're talking about. Examples of this are when a government signs a long-term contract with a corporation that sometimes it wants to get out of later on. And ideally, it would like to get out of that contract without paying compensation. Having the ability of corporations to sue the government prevents governments from doing this kind of thing. We have to question specifically about climate change. It wouldn't prevent you from legislating against carbon emissions, because then you can use what every treaty enshrines and says you can legislate for the public good. What you couldn't do is legislate against oil, but not against coal, which you might have incentives to do because there are strong coal unions that have power at elections that oil doesn't. That's an example of the discrimination where you could sue and where you could do something about it. It doesn't prevent you legislating for the public good. It does prevent you discriminating for political reasons and between companies. Also bear in mind that when they tell you what they want is countries to negotiate, countries to horse trade, one country to talk about iron, the other one to talk about wheat. That is code for a situation where big countries get their way, little countries don't get their cases heard on their merits, and it means it's unfair.
Thank you. And I think the clear issue is that we, across the European Union, negotiating with 27 other countries, have ended up in a position whereby to create a single market in the European Union, we still haven't got that. And the clear issue is that trade is good for Britain, it's good for the world, it's good for all of you. Now, I've heard the issue about climate change loud and clear. The fundamental fact is we need the whole world to agree on combating man-made climate change, and that's what the Paris talks were all about. Do not be fooled into believing that if TTIP is introduced, somehow, shape or form, climate change isn't going to be combated. That is not what this is about. This is about ensuring a level playing field for all businesses across the United Kingdom, the European Union and the United States to create jobs, create prosperity and create an opportunity for everyone whilst maintaining a regulatory regime that is appropriate and set by democratically elected governments. And if we achieve that, not only will you have a brighter future, but so will the planet.
Thank you to the opposition summary speakers, and now to summarise their own arguments on the TTIP debate as a whole, I give my microphone to the opposition summary speakers.
Hello. I didn't realise there was a pre-applause. But thanks. So what you've heard from the opposition has been interesting. I mean, Mr. Anderson makes really great arguments. He constantly tells you what I've been telling you, and I don't recognise any of it. He proved very proficient at slaying straw men, but very poor at actually addressing any of the arguments that we've actually made. And from Mr. Blackman here, the Honourable, sorry, very sorry. He said that climate change, this is just a bit of a side issue here, but not in real life. He's not said it's a side issue, he addressed it, but in this debate, maybe today, it's been a bit of a side issue, and it's not. He said the whole world needs to get back together. As the UK, we have a historical debt to the rest of the world. Our industry, the outsourcing of our industry, we led the way in polluting the world. We should be leading the way in addressing the problem. We can't just wait to act on this. We need to act now. And now, just for a few facts, because we keep hearing about all these reports. Mr. Anderson is a big fan of ISDS, yet he's a big fan of a system that doesn't even say do what it was created to do. It does not lead to increased foreign direct investment anywhere. They keep trying to prove it does, and it doesn't. Even the UK government did a study into this before TTIP. They commissioned LSE Enterprise to look into this, and they found that ISDS in the trade agreement between the EU and US would lead to the UK having no political benefit, no economic benefit, some political risk, no economic risk. For me, the big challenge we face today is climate change, food security, the decline of the natural world. As an environmentalist, I might be expected to say that. And I ask you now, will TTIP increase our ability to do this? Will increasing the ability of exporters and investors to influence our rules and regulation increase our ability to deal with these problems, or will they hinder it? I say hinder, and now I'll pass over to John.
Sam, thank you so much. I think it's been a really good debate, and I'm really pleased to have taken part in this, because this is actually a real issue. The negotiations on TTIP are happening now, and they want to try and conclude those negotiations by the end of President Obama's term in office, i.e. by January of next year. So this is live, it's happening in the next 12 months, and that's what makes it so important. It also makes it very important, as we heard from one of the four speakers, to work out what's actually going to happen. And you're completely right. The European Union's own impact assessment said that there would be at least 11 million tonnes of extra CO2 put into the atmosphere as a direct result of TTIP. It also said, and I will repeat this, not that TTIP was going to lead to the creation of more jobs, but that it would lead to the loss of 1 million jobs, 680,000 of those in Europe, and 325,000 in the USA. These are not our figures. These are the figures which come from the official assessment. And they said quite clearly that if those hundreds of thousands of people lose their jobs, you should not expect that they will find new jobs in their place, given the high level of unemployment we have at the moment, given in particular the high level of youth unemployment, which is where you lot are even more impacted than we would be. And then the final thing around ISDS, the investor-state dispute settlement, the ability for corporations to sue governments. We heard that somehow the European Commission has been listening. Well, let me tell you, they ran a public consultation in 2014. 150,000 people responded, the biggest ever record. 52,000 people responded from this country. What was the answer? Over 97% of people said, no, we do not want to give this power to US corporations to be able to sue us for loss of profits. And what did the European Commission reply? Thank you for your answers, all of which are now being disregarded, because we're not going to have that, we're going to make this permanent. And that is the threat from TTIP. We lose power forever, and that's why I suggest you vote for the motion against TTIP.
I'd like to thank our summary speakers there for some excellent speeches, and I'd like to get one last round of applause for all of them and all of you and all of them. And as I said at the beginning, when we took our first vote, we take a second vote, which makes the first vote have a point, because we can see how your opinions have changed in this room. We had quite a lot of abstentions at the beginning. Maybe we'll have more, maybe we'll have less. Where will you have swung? I hope to find out now. I'll get my vote counters down again at the front. So, to remind you, I've reminded you a lot, but I'll say it once more, you can be a proposition voter, you can be opposition, or you can be abstention. Proposition means that you're against TTIP. This has a opposition means that you're for TTIP. Abstention means that you are somewhere in the middle for whatever reason. So, who now, at the end, after having heard everything, perhaps spoken, perhaps asked, perhaps tweeted, thinks they are a proposition voter? Who would vote with the motion, this House opposes TTIP? Okay, that's counted. And now, who would vote in the opposition? The motion before the House is this House opposes TTIP. Who votes in opposition to that? Who is for TTIP? Hold your hands high. Okay, and the final position you can take of abstention. Who abstains from this vote? Who does not vote proposition or opposite, but abstention? Make sure our vote counters can see your hands. Thank you. Thanks. So I'm just going to get my friend there to count up the votes that we have. And now I'd like to remind you of what we're going to do after we're done here. We, the committee, we in the red jumpers, are going to go to our regular social venue, the bar at TCR, to continue the debate in a slightly less formal setting. Some of the speakers, I'm hoping, may accompany us. I hope that many of you come with us too, so that we can hear all of your views and potentially take advantage of our 10% student discount on drinks, which is an excellent thing, let me tell you. We have two winners to announce tonight. We have the winning floor speech, and we have the winning vote. We're still counting them both up, so I'd just like to let you know that later this week in a reminder, we on Thursdays run training sessions at Society. So you've seen a lot of good speeches. You've seen a speech from a person who went very far in the World Debating Championships. If you want to learn to be able to speak that good in front of audiences, please come along to our training session this Thursday in this very room at 7 o'clock. Also, on Saturday, you can take part in our student debating competition, which is very fun. All of us will be there, and it will be great. So I encourage you to also come down to that. We're just some last minute calculations on these numbers. And now I'm able to tell you that. What should I do first? The votes or the floor? I think the floor, yeah. Good decision. Right. So, at the beginning of tonight, we had okay, sorry about that. Right. Before you heard all the speeches tonight, we had in opposition 8 votes. We had in proposition 49 votes, and we had in abstention 42 votes. As I said at the beginning, we were a house divided and undecided. After we'd heard everything, after you'd spoken yourselves and thought a bit about it, we had, again, in opposition, 8 votes. We had in abstention 18 votes, and we had in proposition 52 votes. So that is the result of tonight's main and floor speeches. I encourage everyone to remember that a lot of people come in. A lot of people disappeared, so that's why the numbers changed slightly. A lot of people didn't know what we were talking about at the beginning. But that's how you vote at the end of the night. And in terms of our floor speeches, there were lots of very good ones, lots of people who added lots of very good stuff. But in the end, only one person could come out as the winner, and that was Jack, the opposition floor speech. Jack, if you could come down, please. Okay, and we will get you your prize. Let's see what good looking. Excellent. So that's the result of tonight. That was what happened in the main debate, and that was what happened in the floor debates. I encourage you to come on Thursday to this room at 7. I encourage you to come to the bar now to talk more about TTIP. And